Russia is weak. The Russian people don't support the government. They will not withstand the might of the United States and its allies. All of that, of course, has ended up on the ash heap of history. Russia is enormously powerful. They have a population that loves the country. They're Russians. They believe in themselves. They believe in their religion. They believe in what they are, and they're willing to fight for it.
You have been an outspoken critic of this war, and you have said that all the media we're seeing here in the UK and in the US is telling us the wrong story. They've been demonizing Putin, and you've been saying, wait a second, that's not true.
This man, Putin, is by far the most Western-friendly leader that you're going to see in Russia. If he vanishes and someone else takes his place, the probability of a successor being far more difficult to deal with and less informed about the West is very high. We should take that into consideration. And what's his principal message? We have been here since 932. We are not going anywhere. We will continue to exist. Understand that. We want to live with you. We want you to live with us. We're not the same. But our interests and your interests do not necessarily conflict. We have no interest in Eastern Europe. We're not interested in a war in Eastern Europe.
I'm curious what you think of this upcoming election. Jim Rickards says it's Trump in a landslide. Do you think that might be true?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? It could be true. In fact, it may well be the case. And remember, the last time he was successful in 2016, it was because people came out in great numbers. And they hadn't figured out how to defeat that yet on the left. They had grossly underestimated him. That could happen again. And that's the point. If it does, I don't know how you contain the anger that will erupt.
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, the decorated combat veteran, author, and foreign policy expert. You are widely recognized as one of the preeminent military strategists of your time and spent over 28 years working at the highest levels of the U.S. military. You've been a regular commentator on CNN, the BBC, and Fox News, most notably on the Tucker Carlson Show. And in 2020, Donald Trump appointed you as senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense. You believe the greatest threat to America comes from within Washington, D.C., and that the $34 trillion national sovereign debt will inevitably collapse the economy. You've also said that the open border policy continues, Americans will lose their culture and their sense of national identity. And you believe Israel's war with Hamas has developed into a campaign of depopulation, something that could force the U.S. into a showdown with the entire Islamic world and potentially Russia and China. Colonel Macgregor, welcome back to London Real.
Well, thank you. I think you've answered all the questions. I'm not sure we have much to talk about.
You know, I actually wanted to jump into a topic that I've heard you comment on, but we haven't talked about before we get into a lot of the foreign policy and the national events happening there in the States, and that is your comments on Bitcoin. I kind of find that fascinating because, again, we haven't talked about it before, and a lot of people wouldn't expect you to bring something like that up. We have been kind of deep into this blockchain space for the last 3 years, so we're familiar with it. We're seeing Bitcoin coming back to some of its all-time highs. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts on Bitcoin and why have you been vocal about it lately?
Well, I don't know that I've been all that vocal. I was asked a question and I answered honestly. You have someone in your midst whom I hold in very high esteem. His name is Alistair MacLeod. And Alistair has a lot to say about the financial warfare that is being waged right now. And what Mr. Putin is doing, along with his colleagues in China and India, to lead a substantial portion of the world, if not most of it, towards a gold-backed currency. And I think Alistair MacLeod is absolutely correct. The question is, what do we in the West do? And I have a great deal of difficulty believing that we can adopt a gold-backed approach to finance. So I think that the digital currency that is not controlled by the central banks, by the way, in other words, independent like Bitcoin, does have a future. And it's a store of value. It's not imaginary. It's quite real. And I think we may end up seeing that kind of digital currency replace what we today call fiat currency. Now, when will that happen? How soon? I don't know. But I'm sort of got one foot in two camps. One foot is in the camp with Nassim Taleb. The other foot is in the camp with Alasdair Macleod. And in the middle, I see Bitcoin as a third way forward.
Wow, that's fascinating. And again, it's a credit to you, Colonel, that you're open-minded enough to consider something like that, because a lot of people just kind of dismiss it with kind of the usual rhetoric about it. But, you know, the spot ETF has been approved and now billions are flowing into it. And it's now considered a legitimate diversified financial asset. But more so than that, it's something that's kind of independent. There have been people that said we wouldn't be in these wars if we didn't have this fiat currency. We could inflate at will and throw money around to these causes that don't have a lot to do with domestic sovereignty. I'm curious if you think that might be the case of when politicians are allowed to just print money willy-nilly, that they oftentimes throw it to the wrong places.
Well, it all begins with central banking. And, we've had this Federal Reserve since 1913, and every president up until Woodrow Wilson resisted it. Ultimately, Woodrow Wilson later apologized to the American people for signing it into law. And I think the central banking system that dominates the West is one of the reasons that we are in a position of hostility towards Russia. Russia wants to be out from under it. China doesn't want to be suppressed or dominated by it. I think we can go back and look at the two world wars and make a very good case that central banking led to those. So yes, I'm a critic of central banking, but in the meantime, I don't expect to lead any rebellions or revolutions to remove it. And so the one way that you can go forward in a different direction and avoid it is digital currency, Bitcoin.
Fascinating. All right, that's great to get your perspective on that, to be continued probably in a future conversation. I wanted to jump in and get your thoughts on a very fascinating, I would call, geopolitical event which happened a couple weeks ago, and that was Tucker Carlson traveling to Moscow to interview the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, who hadn't really been interviewed by anyone in the West for, I think, 5 or 7 years. And I'd love to get your thoughts, because you have been an outspoken critic of this war between Ukraine and Russia, and you have said that all the media we're seeing here in the UK and in the US is telling us the wrong story. They've been demonizing Putin and making him out to be X, Y, and Z. And you've been saying, wait a second, that's not true. Actually, Putin wants this, this, and this. And it was fascinating for me to watch that interview almost through the Macgregor lens of what you've been saying. And I must say, Colonel, most of what you said seemed to be true as my feeling of what Putin is all about. But I'll pass it over to you. What did you see there, and what did you make of this historic event?
Well, I think President Putin was emphasizing certain things that we in the West don't really pay enough attention to. First of all, he's emphasizing strategic interests in the broad sense. We tend to personalize everything, and that's ridiculous. It doesn't make any difference whether the leader of the United States or Great Britain or any other sovereign state and the leader of Russia love each other or hate each other. What counts are interests, strategic interests. We've gotten away from that because, frankly, I'm talking about the United States, we're not pursuing our strategic interests. We have no strategic interest in Eastern Ukraine. In fact, one can make the argument that the only real strategic interests we have are in prosperity, peace, and stability, all of which are inextricably intertwined. We are preeminently a commercial power. People talk about the American empire. Well, it's much like the British Empire in the sense that we are a commercial empire. Now, if we're failing, it's because we've lost sight of the commercial purposes of our outreach. We've substituted military power for economic influence and investment. We've substituted military power for cultural and political understanding and cooperation. So I think that's part of why Tucker did what he did. I mean, let's face it, we've been listening to all sorts of terrible things about this man, Putin, and people eagerly inhale all this nonsense instead of listening to the man who is currently the Russian head of state. And what's his principal message? We have been here since 932. We are not going anywhere. We will continue to exist. Understand that. We want to live with you. We want you to live with us. We're not the same. But our interests and your interests do not necessarily conflict. We have no interest in Eastern Europe. We're not interested in a war in Eastern Europe. And of course, as you and I have talked before, All you had to do was look at the initial stage of this Russian special military operation. When they went in with a very small force. Only 90,000 combat troops. There were 200,000 involved, but only 90,000 who actually do any fighting. And they were very anxious to have a settlement. And they were very close to reaching a settlement. And then Boris Johnson, at the behest of the United States government, flew in to effectively destroy the agreement, which he did, and ensure that the war would continue. And he made a number of statements in private to Zelensky, which were wrong and fundamentally false. And those statements are the things we tell ourselves. Russia is weak. The Russian economy is weak. The Russian people don't support the government. They will not withstand the might of the United States and its allies. We have more economic power, more influence, and the support of the people. All of that, of course, has ended up on the ash heap of history. Russia is enormously powerful. Why? They have an abundance of resources that they can draw upon. They have a population that loves the country. They're Russians. They believe in themselves. They believe in their religion. They believe in their country and their leadership. Does that mean that they all love Putin? Certainly not. But they believe in what they are and they're willing to fight for it. So we set up Ukraine for failure and we've destroyed that nation. We've killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians needlessly. We've driven half the population out of the country, probably 1 million plus wounded on top of the more than 500,000 dead. It's a catastrophe. And you know what? At some point, the United States will do what it has always done. Leave. We just leave. We are preeminently a maritime power and an aerospace power. When things don't go our way, we pack up and we go home. We are only a land power in the Western Hemisphere. And so that's one of the reasons we've tried to fight this war against Russia on the cheap at the expense of the Ukrainian people. And I would argue at the expense of the Europeans, whose economies are in ruins. So in sum, I have not much more to say except that this is what's going to happen in the future. We will just leave. And then the Europeans are going to have to sort out whatever remains. And I don't know what that'll be. I can't predict that with certainty because if you sat down with Putin today, and this should have been very clear from that interview, and said, look, we want to put an end to this. You could say to Putin, you draw the line that you think is commensurate with your strategic interests, and then we'll draw our line and we'll come to some sort of agreement. And no one's willing to do that, but that's the quickest and easiest way to end the war, because we're not going to attract any positive investment into Ukraine to restore any measure of civilization there until this is over.
You know, I had General Flynn on the show 2 days ago, and he heard Putin talking about his interest to join NATO and how they were continually rebuffed administration after administration. And he corroborated that. He said, yeah, that is what I understood happening as well. And so, again, for the first time ever, we almost got a lens into Putin. And like you said, he's not this kind of big bad wolf that everyone kind of inhaled the story there. You could actually, I believed him that he was rebuffed by various U.S. administrations when he was actually trying to find some way to settle so he could move forward as well. So I found that very interesting as well.
Well, you know, one of the things that we ought to keep in mind, both you and the British and the other Europeans and Americans, is that this man, Putin, is by far the most Western-friendly leader that you're going to see in Russia. He's someone who's lived outside the country, traveled extensively. You know, he's personally familiar with other long-standing successful leaders like Modi in India or Xi in China. He understands the geopolitical environment very well. He understands economics very well, which is why I mentioned Alistair MacLeod earlier, who really understands what Putin is doing in financial terms. But he's friendly to the West. He wants to live with the West. If he vanishes and someone else takes his place, the probability of a successor being far more difficult to deal with and less informed about the West is very high. We should take that into consideration.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we could see that quite plainly in that conversation. And so I'm so glad that that happened.